So let me share.
Hi all, this is our second class with Diti, Bhadra, and over to you, Diti.
Okay. Thank you, Nakshi. Here I will share. Okay, so last class we looked at this table that we arrived at the end of all of that happened with respect to what is the category of a model, what is the type of complement it takes, and what's the case on the subject. Right. So and I wanted to mention these are all positive models, meaning there is no negation anywhere in the picture here. And these are all interchangeable to some extent. So Bangla speakers can, sort of detect that many of these translations can go for many of the different items. So they're not necessarily, so for example, need is not just dorkar, can also be hobe, etc. So these are sort of interchangeable to a certain extent. Okay, so this is the table that we had. People have any questions about this table? Sort of this is clear. And in the test, we mentioned that this is the kind of table we want to make for other languages to see what is the nature of complementation with obligation. Okay, so yesterday we heard from at least one Bangla speaker that they allow a gerund with a verbal modal, right? So you guys were, those of you who were not yesterday, a few days ago in the first class. So something like Tomar Dilli Jawa Lagbe. Okay, so I'm going to call this dialect 2. So as I was saying, my dialect, let's call that dialect 1, does not have this construction. So I went and did a quick survey with some friends and family to see what is the nature of this number 2 here. Remember, so if this is our table, here, this I have delineated as taking only an infinitive complement. And this data point is interesting because it's saying it can take a gerund 2. And when you have to modal or a verbal modal, so the results are such. So if you have something like tomar apelta khawa lagbe, you have to eat the apple. 10 to 12 people that I consulted all said they're either ungrammatical or very degraded with a gerund with this verb. Same for this number 3. We have to drop the kids off at school tomorrow. Amader kal bachchader skole diye asha lagbe sounds degraded to many folks. Panchta boi ana lagbe with the meaning that 5 books need to be brought. Remember, we have to keep the obligation reading, the deontic necessity reading in mind, so not epistemic or any other flavor. Class chalu korte 10টা ছাত্র আসা লাগবে, that also is ungrammatical. So to start the class, 10 students have to come to class. So the findings are in dialect 1, the dialect I've been reporting on. All of these are ungrammatical or marginal. So my question for people who find things like 1 grammatical is to do, maybe you could conduct a more, a longer paradigm to see if these are all grammatical in dialect 2 or not. So these are.
Excuse me. The comment from Utpal in the chat that says that this is probably gerund plus lagbe is probably an Eastern Bengali variant.
Right. So this is a different dialect from the one that I was.
One of them, and I know this is not part of Sylheti, so it might be some other variety, but certainly not Sylheti.
Whatever it is, the data point should not be just number 1. The data point should be different types of subjects, right? So, and lack of subjects. So say, if, for example, there is no subject here, it's like a arbitrary sort of agent. So these kind of things we have to, test throughout to see what is the robustness of this grammatical fact. And then remember, we have another verbal modal which functions as has to, which is hobe. Basically, if you do a test with hobe for all of these with a deontic reading, they're all ungrammatical. Okay, at least in dialect 1. So for example, if I say Panchta boi ana hobe, that to these speakers sounds like it's an epistemic statement. It's a description of some sort of events in the world or the reality in the world. So again, the question is, if you're testing with Lagbe, you should also test with Hobe and see what is the robustness of the fact. So for the purposes of this course, I'm going to keep this construction aside. I'm only going to analyze dialect 1. And then after some explanations, when we put together everything we have learned in the last lecture today, and then on the third lecture, when we put stuff together, then we can have some discussion about what could be different in dialect 2. What is the nature of the distinction? Okay, so then, yeah, so I think MoMA has dialect 2, right? So yeah, a good finding would be to see across these subjects and with Hobe as well. Okay, so going back to our table then, so this is what we will try to explain. This is the dialect 1 table, and dialect 2 would probably differ over here. But then you have to check with both, and you have to check across a bunch of different constructions. So now looking at this, as I said, negation is not yet here. So this is positive modals, which are interchangeable. We are seeing 3 types of complements, right? So this is where we finished last time. We're seeing gerund complements with some modals. We are seeing gerunds or finite clauses with some other types of modals. And we are seeing infinitive complements with some modals. So in Bangla, we already have these 3 types. And then there are some case correlations where gerunds only take, when we have gerund complements, the subject is always in the genitive case, never in dative case. With adjectival modals, when you allow gerunds, they have to be in genitive case. With finite clauses, they're in the unmarked or nominative case. And then with infinitive complements, both gerunds or datives are allowed on the subject. Okay. So so we have, let's look at a couple of these properties together. So gerunds only have gen-marked subjects. Complements of modals, as we looked at last class, when the reading is ought to be over ought to do. Remember, both are possible. One is more salient over the other, as we looked at certain contexts. So with gerund complements, the ought to be reading of a deontic necessity is more salient. And then we saw they cannot be complements of verbal deontic modals, which are tense. And now why I have highlighted this tense part become clear later, but we just want to keep that in mind. Then we take infinitive complements. They can have gen or dative mark subjects. And we saw that they are complements of modals when the salient reading is more ought to do reading of deontic necessity than ought to be. And then can be complements of verbal deontic modals, which carry tense marking. And then we also see finite clauses. These are maybe the most sort of familiar to us as objects. So we see unmarked case only on subjects, or unmarked case only. And the overt subject, since the subject of the embedded clause is overt, remember there is the Feldman's distinction between ought to do and ought to be reading is if there is a bearer of obligation that is syntactically expressed, often as a subject, then it necessitates an ought to do reading. So given that the subject of the embedded clause is expressed overtly, given there is finiteness in the lower clause, so then the ought to do reading comes. And these cannot be complements of verbal deontic modals, which are tensed. So then the sort of question we were, getting to is what kinds of differences are there in the structures inside these types? So these are different types of complements. What is the structures inside them? And then these modals, these different types of modals, as we saw on our table, what are they sensitive to when they're selecting a complement? Okay. So before we get into internal structure of each of these, and then the third class will be where we actually compare the internal structures. Today we will talk about certain properties of these things. So here is a general take on how modal predicates and modal verbs work, right, with respect to complementation or kind of structure they allow in the same configuration. So it's an old idea that modal expressions are keyed to an individual. Okay, so as we talked about last class, somebody's knowledge state, somebody's desire, somebody's responsibility, somebody's goals, somebody's obligation. So that is the individual that modal expressions are keyed to. Something is happening. The rest of my slide is missing. Hold on one second. Do you guys see it in your handout, if anyone is looking at it? Let me try opening it. One second. Okay. Let's try this. Okay, so I don't know what happened with that slide, but here. So so this idea is of that there is an individual that this model, the modal backgrounds, the modal bases are keyed to. So Haggard sort of was one of the first to show syntactically that this individual can be either a participant in the VP event or a participant in the speech event. So I remember we saw this in, say, a spine. So the speech event is much higher. This is a speech act phrase, etc. There are coordinates there. A model can be anchored to those coordinates high up, or participants in the VP low down. So that leads to certain scope and other sort of distinctions. So then the question became, how does one encode the relationship between a deontic modal and this individual that we talk about? Right? So a whole host of work assumes that deontic modals, at least in English, assign a theta role to an agent. So, and this agent thus becomes this bearer of obligation or bearer of whatever the deontic thing requires. So this theta role is given to an agent, and thus what you have is a control structure. Now, I had asked Aisha if all of you would be familiar with the raising and control. I am assuming everyone is familiar. She said people would be familiar. Is there anybody who doesn't know what a control structure is or would like a refresher, or what a raising structure is, would like a refresher? Okay, you can ask me questions as I talk about it. So this is a control structure on the right. So the hallmark of a control structure is, so there is an infinitive in the lower clause. The infinitive has to assign a theta role to its subject. The subject is a null position. Remember, except in exceptional case marking situations, you don't have overt subjects inside in the subject position of an infinitive. So the subject position of an infinitive is quote unquote empty. So to bear the theta role of the lower clause, there's a pro inserted, a null pro that takes a theta role, and then the modal itself, or whatever verb is embedding this infinitive, has a separate theta role to assign, and that is the overt subject of the entire construction. So basically, control was postulated as a way, or this pro was postulated as a way to prevent a violation of the theta criterion. What does the theta criterion say? Everything that assigns a theta role has to be assigned to an argument of some sort, right? You can't have a theta role not be assigned to an argument if there is a theta role to be assigned. So we have two things in a control structure, right? We have an overt element that is taking the theta role from the tensed matrix predicate, and then we have an infinitive assigning the to eat or to read, whatever you have in the lower clause, assigning a theta role to a pro. So here's the idea. So if you assume this with all of these folks, if you assume this with all of these folks that the deontic models assign a theta role to an agent, then you kind of have to have this structure, whereby because what will happen to the infinitive's theta role, right? So if you have a model assigning a theta role, then you have to have something, the subject getting that theta role. Then what happens to the infinitive's theta role? So you have to have a control structure with pro. So some of these scholars point out that suppose you have something like John has to consult Bill on every decision. So then you have this pro sitting in the subject position of the infinitive, and then so often what they show is in the deontic model structures, the subject bears the bearer of obligation. We saw that in previous class. So this pro is controlled by John. Okay, and so the to consult part assigns this obligation of consulting. There's an obligation that someone has to consult Bill on every decision, and that someone is John. And later work, say Brennan, etc., have shown that the thematic subject need not be the syntactic subject. So for example, you can say thesis paper must be async-free. Now, when you're submitting your thesis, it's not the thesis that's ensuring that. It's some arbitrary pro, whoever thesis it is, has to ensure that the obligation is met, that the thesis paper is not the bearer of obligation. Some random person is a bearer of obligation, whoever thesis is. So pro is controlled by an arbitrary person. People have any questions about this general structure? So all of this work assumes that whenever you have a deontic model with an infinitive complement, there is control. Okay. In contrast, sorry, yeah. Did I hear something? Okay. Let me be ambitious and go back to my original handout to see if things are working. 1 second.
Diti?
Yeah.
Everything okay?
Yeah. Can you guys, what can you see?
Now we can see the slide. Modal predicates and verbs profile 1.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, so you can see profile 2 now, this slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so so this was the earlier part. The earlier slide was showing you that people assume that whenever there's a deontic model with an infinitive complement, there has to be control. In contrast, a bunch of people argue that nope, instead what we have is a raising structure. So going back to Barbiers and several other people, it is assumed that no matter what type of model you have, more specifically, these authors look at deontics and epistemics, and the idea is they always give rise to raising structures and not control. So raising is the complete opposite of control. So let's see how. So if you look at this structure here, So there is only one theta role to be assigned. The higher predicate, this mod over here, does not have a theta role to assign. Okay, so that's why you can give, say, so think of your quintessential raising predicate like see, mom, or appear. It appears that it appears to be raining outside or something. So appear or seem by itself does not have a theta role to assign. Therefore, it can take an explicit subject. So in that case, there is no raising, but in the case of raising, what happens is the subject always originates in the lower clause. It bears the theta role of the infinitive. And then it raises up for tense reasons or for EPP reasons, whatever reasons, it raises up to higher than the higher predicate, but the higher predicate has no connection to the subject, quote unquote, right? So, so there is no theta role that this higher predicate is assigning to the subject. So therefore it's disconnected. So the subject originates in the lower clause. So note, if you go this route, if you say that these are all raising structures, not control, then you're quintessentially saying that the the bearer of obligation is not represented anywhere, right? So think about the previous sort of idea that the theta role is what was the bearer of obligation. So now you're saying there is no bearer of obligation. So all of these folks, especially Bhatt, Wurmbrand, Grano, etc., argue that actually deontic models do not you do not need to syntactically represent the bearer of obligation. Okay, it should not be overtly anywhere explicitly expressed. It should all be contextual. And we look at this idea in detail. So we have the control guys, we have the raising guys, and in the middle we have people like Brennan, Landau, etc., who look at the distinction that we talked about last time, the ought to do versus ought to be deontic necessity interpretations. So their argument is ought to do deontic structures are control-like, whereas ought to be deontic structures are raising-like. So, so there's a divide based on if there is a syntactic bearer of obligation represented, and they will be controlling the pro, versus there is no syntactic bearer of obligation represented, so there is no pro to control, and therefore you have raising. So then the crucial point for all of these approaches is how does the right entity, or in the case of arbitrary obligation, nobody, basically, how does the right entity or nobody at all end up being the bearer of the obligation described by the infinitive? Okay, how do you get it to work out exactly as it should? So, so it seems like from what we've learned across these approaches, a null pro would be the most intuitive answer because you have direct control. And those of you familiar with control theory, this is usually designated as obligatory control. So not optional control, obligatory control, that pro has to be controlled by something in the structure. So that seems to be the most intuitive answer. So then we have to ask, so why do these raising proponents talk about raising and not control? So let's zoom in on Bhatt's analysis. He was one of the first, and also focuses on Hindi, so the facts are accessible to us. So Bhatt proposed in 1998 that it is unnecessary to postulate a control analysis to mark this bearer of obligation syntactically, because this is often not syntactically expressed. So, so his point is a syntactic control analysis is clearly unavailable if the control is analysis is meant to represent the bearer of obligation as a controller. So one of the first reasons is he gives two sets of reasons. The first reason is it's, according to him, it's always a process of inference in the context. Like who is the bearer of obligation is always contextually inferred. So, so look at this first sentence here. We are expecting 50 guests tonight. There have to be 50 chairs in the living room by 5 p.m. There is this obligation encoding modal have to. When this is said to party organizers, the BFO, the bearer of obligation, is entirely absent from the syntax. So the party organizers are not part of, syntactically, not part of the sentence. Okay, so the bearer of obligation argument is entirely contextual, whoever you're talking to. Then something like John has to eat an apple today, and this is said as an instruction to John's caretaker at the daycare. So then the bearer of obligation is John. Right, so John has to fulfill the obligation of eating an apple. And some of you might notice, so he says that bearer of obligation is denoted by the subject, but it's sort of shared, right? If you're saying it to John's caretaker also has to ensure that John is eating the apple. And then John has to be consulted by, Bill has to be consulted by John on every decision. So here, I think my slide cut out here, but basically, if you look at the bearer of obligation, it is John, who is in a by phrase. Okay, so it is not the syntactic subject of the sentence. The bearer of obligation is now in an adjunct. Okay, so his point is here that control analysis very rigidly tie in bearer of obligation to the subject. This is by nature of how control works. You have to have something C commanding the pro to control the pro in an obligatory control situation. So his point is it's too rigidly tied to the subject, and that is too narrow. We can have different, so it under-generates a lot. Then the second reason he provides for going the raising route is to look at Hindi in a specific type of construction called obligational construction. And his claim is this, and he looks at this construction in a bunch of different South Asian languages. So if you guys are interested, I have the reference here, just look at the paper. So the second reason is this, this construction, he argues, only involves raising. So here's an example. I've tried to color code things. So let's say you have on this construction, John has to read a book. Okay. The obligation construction is a combination of possession and a non-verbal part. So if you're looking for the definition of an obligation construction, it is basically a construction that highlights the link between possession and obligation. So you have a thing that marks possession, and in Hindi, you have a non-finite verbal part. So the non-finite part is this to read. In English, it's this infinitive, and then you have possession. So let's look at his examples here. So you can say, John ko sir dard hai. This is a simple possessive construction. John has a headache. So what we see here is there's a dative mark subject, right? And a be form. Okay, and together they're giving you possession. Okay. Now if you have John ko seb khana hai. Now this is the obligation construction, and you have dative subject and gerund. So he's calling this part, this khana, as a gerund. This is contra Mahajan, who calls it an infinitive. There are several reasons. Either of them call it whatever. So let's go with Bhat's classification here. So he's calling this non-finite part. So remember, infinitives and gerunds are marked with the same syncretic marking, na, in Hindi. As opposed to Bangla, which does the two different sort of markings. So here is an obligation construction where you have that possession and you have a non-finite part. So he notices that many languages which use be, this part be, the hai part, in possessive constructions, for example, a bunch of languages in South Asia use be with an oblique subject in the obligational construction. So he's contrasting be possession languages with have possession languages. Have possession languages are like English and some other European languages. Contrast, so we don't really have a has in the South Asian languages, we have a be instead, right? So there's a be possession languages and have possession languages. And he notices whenever we have be possession languages, we have this oblique meaning dative or some non-structural case like that. So something oblique marking experience or something like that in the subject position. Okay, so So taking this as a background, any questions about this? People understand the obligational construction? Note that crucially, this is a distinct type of obligational configuration from what we have been looking at so far. So we have been looking at overt deontic necessity models. Right. So last class we talked about different types of obligation with different types of overt models. Here you're not seeing any overt model. Okay, so this is not your other type of overtly expressed hi Aisha model configuration. This is a possession configuration with a non-finite verbal part added. Okay. So let's look at his argument. So suppose you take another example. Tim ko dawai pini hai. So this is your quintessential Hindi obligational construction. Bhatt argues that gerunds in general can have genitive subjects, but when you put them inside obligational constructions in Hindi, they cease to have genitive subjects. So something like this, Rumi ko Leela ka seb khana hai, to mean Rumi has an obligation that Leela eats the apple, and that is just bad, that is ungrammatical. So the idea is this genitive marker on the subject of this gerund is just not possible in this obligational construction. So, so then he goes into this path here. So this can be explained if the obligational construction is assumed to involve raising. So this this subject that we have in 9 has raised from a lower clause to the higher clause, just like in a raising structure. And so if we assume this, we can also see other kinds of evidence in the language that supports this kind of case distinctions between dative and genitive. So let's look at a couple of examples. So he shows that when you have an unergative verb and a gerund in a lower clause with in the be construction, you cannot have accusative case. Okay. I have to have dative. So Han ko dawai pini thi hai. Han has to had or has to drink medicine. You cannot say Han dawai pini thi. So without any marking, you can't have this here. So you have to have this. So remember, dative and accusative are the same in Hindi, right? So it's syncretic. So his argument is these are all datives. These are not accusatives. So the idea is if you have an unergative verb like pee, drink is an unergative verb, then you have to have a dative subject. Versus when you have an unaccusative verb like katna, so then you have to have this ko is an accusative ko and not a dative ko. So is tehni ko katna tha hai in this be construction. This gets marked with accusative. So given what we know about unergatives and unaccusatives, remember unaccusative verbs have an internal argument or an object, which raises to a higher position, to the subject position, whereas unergative verb base generate their subjects. Okay, so unergative verbs, there is no movement of the syntactic subject is base generated in an unergative verb. What looks like the syntactic subject is actually underlyingly the object in an unaccusative verb. So this facts correlated with these case facts, he uses together to argue for raising. So he's saying the case on the syntactic subject is determined by whether or not it is an underlying subject or object. So subjects get dative, objects get accusative. Given this paradigm, since we have movement from a lower position to a higher position, there is raising. Okay. So, so crucially, so this is his argumentation for there is no control in this structure. Okay, it's all raising. So as I was mentioning earlier, we see no overt modal, right, in the Hindi obligational construction, unlike with actual overt obligational modals that we have been looking at. So then the question becomes, where does the modal interpretation come from? So if you're looking at things like Tim ko dawai pini hai, and there is no overt modal, where is the sense of obligation coming from that Tim has the obligation of drinking medicine? Okay, so his proposal is that there is a covert modal head that takes a VP or an extended projection of the VP as a complement. So this covert modal, in case you're wondering about its properties, is just like overt modals we have looked at before, chahiye, hoga, padhega, etc., other deontic necessity models. It has universal force and it has deontic flavor, and it is just like all these other models, except that it's covert. Okay, so he does not formally define this covert modal head. Things just fall into place. So he argues that this is this has to be the case, and dative case has nothing to do with marking obligation, because note that even if you mark in Hindi, even if you mark a subject with dative, you are not entailing that that subject is a bearer of obligation. So here's an example he provides. इस फिल्म को बहुत पैसा बनाना है, नहीं तो मैं बर्बाद हो जाऊंगा. Okay, so if you notice, film is a subject, and you can't drop the ko. Okay, that notation is saying you can't. It's not optional. You can't drop it. So so the is film is marked with ko. It is the dative marking, and it is not. The film is not the bearer of obligation. Okay. People agree with this judgment. In this case, the bearer of obligation is not the film. Remember, in the first class, we talked about how the concept of bearer of obligation necessarily has been argued to be animate agents. If you remember the Tagalog facts, we were looking at where animate subjects versus inanimate subjects cannot appear in, cannot appear in positions of bearer of obligation. So there's an animacy requirements to being a bearer of obligation. But intuitively, do people agree that this, the film has no obligation? Like the film persona, like the film understood to be a generator of money?
It's difficult to say. I mean, because I can't think of any other bearer.
So you're saying the film is the bearer or not the bearer?
I mean, it doesn't feel right that it should be an inanimate should be a bearer of obligation, but I can't say that there is some other bearer. So, I mean, so I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what other people feel.
How about the full crew behind it, the director, producer, that implicit animate team behind the movie making?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the only bearer I can think, but they are not obliged to make money, right? They will be making the money.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, are they bearing an obligation to make money?
Yeah, so that's the question. The bearer of obligation is a very narrow thing, right?
Yeah.
It is exactly who this obligation in the structure corresponds to. So
Yeah.
Ojasvi's intuition is what Rajesh would probably argue, that you know, there are other people, there are animate people who are not in the sentence. Remember, his whole thing about raising is that bearer of obligation is not syntactically expressed. So it always is contextual, except in narrow cases where the subject is a bearer, you know. Yeah, so this is an argument he provides, that the film itself is not the bearer of obligation. It doesn't go around carrying this responsibility. It just, you know, it just is the way it is. So, but there is an obligational meaning here. there is something like this obligational construction is imparting some notion of obligation. Yeah, Meghna.
Ma'am, just now I came across a sentence that is Jamata Shukono Dorkar or
Yeah.
Jamata Shukonor Dorkar. In this sentence, what would be the the bearer of, as you was talking about the bearer of obligation? Like we can't actually provide any person for bearing obligation in this particular sentence, right?
Yeah, so these cases are like the ones we talked about last class. So we have ought to do versus ought to be modality. Ought to be deontic necessity is when there is no bearer of obligation that is evident. So the example I think I gave last class was, suppose you're going on a morning walk with people and you see a big beehive and you say, "Mochakta bhanga dorkar." You're not really telling your people around you or not telling anybody specific, but you're just saying as a statement of the world, about the world, right? So this Jamata Shukuno Dorkar to me seems like an ought to be reading, but there is no express or explicit bearer of obligation. Versus compare something to like the Hobe cases we were looking at, Jamata Amader Shukote Hobe, so we have to dry the clothing. That is an ought to do expression of modal deontic necessity, and that is when there is a syntactic, when there is an explicit bearer of obligation. Okay, so yes, so we can have cases of obligation or deontic necessity where there's an explicit bearer, that's an ought to do side. We can have cases where there is not an explicit bearer, that's an ought to be side. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, there are two sentences which one of them has a gerund and another has a participle probably. One of the sentences I told you right now, Jamata Shukono Dorkar, and the other one is Jamata Shukonor Dorkar. So, do these two sentences have any particular meaning difference, or it's just like some syntactical differences that it carries?
So if you have access to the email, I think the organizer sent around announcing these lectures, there are 2 papers attached. And one of the papers is a paper I co-wrote with Orko Banerjee here. It's called Bhadra and Banerjee 2020. And we exactly look at this raw marking on the gerund.
Okay.
So, so the entire paper is about why with Dorkar Proyojon type models, you can have a regular gerund or this gerund marked with a ra. Okay. Versus things like uchit, you cannot. Right. So, if you would take a look at that paper and let me know if you have more questions about that. So, but in that paper, we do explicitly posit a difference between the 2 interpretations. It's a subtle difference, but we provide a formal analysis of what that difference could be.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So yeah, sorry for not translating. This is a habit from JNU, not translating Bangla sentences that I have incurred and still have it. Okay, so this is his idea here. So there's a covert modality head. That's what's giving the obligation. Case marking or this dative oblique subjects have do not have any relation to obligation. Okay. So then you might be wondering, okay, then why do datives appear in obligation constructions? Why are they always dative? What is the entire, all of these things working together? How does it work? So wait. Paul is asking, is Jamata Shukunor Dorkar good for all Bangla speakers? It's definitely good for me. I don't know about others. With Dorkar, I can always take a gerund that has the raw on it. Yeah, so if people are interested in the morphology of the gerund, this was very intriguing for me and Orko, why this gerund can have a raw marking. If you guys remember from my slides yesterday and today, the raw is a genitive marker in Bangla. Why is it appearing on the gerund, right? So versus what's a regular, why do some modal predicates allow gerunds with marking and gerunds without marking? So, and some don't. So that's the paper that is linked in that email. Okay, so let's look at his analysis. So this is English, John has to eat an apple. Lots of things are happening here. Main things to note are, okay, so this is raising, John has raised from the VP, so VP internal subject, raised from there, bunch of different steps, and moved up to the top of the B phrase and the spec. There is some sort of what he calls incorporation between the D or the postposition P in different languages and the copula. We don't need to get too much into that. But crucially, there's a covert modal head. Okay, so so this is his English structure for an obligation construction, like John has to eat an apple. So in contrast, so in English, the subject moves high for case. In Hindi, I think my spur disappeared. Spec DP, this is spec. Okay, so we'll quickly add that here. So this is spec DP. Spec DP is a case licensing position in Hindi, not in English. So if you look at the spec DP being talked about here, this DP right here, this the English subject passes through here but doesn't stop there because it doesn't get case. Whereas in Hindi, the subject stops here. This is a case licensing position. Okay, so the underlying subject gets case in spec DP and does not move higher. The copula, the hai, takes the DP as its argument. In Hindi, there is no incorporation between B and DP. That's the co-marking. As you can see, there is no bearer of obligation represented anywhere. There is no pro-like element anywhere. So what is the dative subject? Inspired by Keynes' analysis, arguing for similar kind of idea, Bhatt argues that the dative on the subject is only a reflex of its presence or passage through spec DP. So the very fact that it passes through spec DP, the reflex of that is dative marking. And crucially, it is not to be correlated with the subjects being the bearer of obligation. Okay. So the Hindi structure is something like here that he provides. As you see, you have Ram situated at the end of the derivation in the spec of DP. That's the case licensing position. And you have the covert modal that takes this VP arguments, just like in English. And you have the copula head at the end. And this modal, somehow, he doesn't formally define the modal head. That's one part we have to remember. The modal head, though, somehow assigns obligation. People understand this? Any questions about this raising analysis of obligation? Okay, so the important thing to remember, so we have spent some time talking about, dative versus genitive, what that means. So if you remember last class, we talked about different types of interpretations with these models, with this case marking. Now we're learning from these approaches that case marking is not really an indicator of anything. It's not an indicator of bearer of obligation, at least in Hindi. Okay, so I want to highlight a couple of problems for Bhatt when it comes to Bangla. Okay, so if everybody is on board with this basic analysis he proposes, we get the sense that he would predict that these two structures should be in free variation in Bangla. So remember, we have two possibilities with our obligational construction with this hobe, same with lagbe. So you have Ramer onek bhore utte hobe, Ramke onek bhore utte hobe. So these structures that we were looking at, there's genitive marking and there's dative marking. So either is allowed in this construction, right? And how to predict, since there is no correlation of case with the bearer of obligation, these should be in free variation. Okay, again, there is some problem with. Let me open this in a different. Okay, let me try this. Okay, so still trying to figure out. Something crazy is happening with my slides and between Adobe and Preview. Okay, maybe Rajesh is here somewhere and he's controlling something. Okay, so this is his analysis, and these are the things I was talking about. So here are the two cases. As we saw in the previous lecture, I was highlighting that there is a sophisticated distinction between the two intuitively. So the subject with the genitive marking is more amenable to a descriptive reading over a directive reading. And the opposite holds for the subject with dative case marking. Anyone remembers what is the difference between descriptive and directive readings of deontic modals? Anyone would care to remind me? Okay, so a descriptive model. So if you guys remember, there is the bearer of obligation, but then there is also the source of obligation. Who is imposing the obligation? So from the literature on imperatives, we have these two terminology that we posited last time. A descriptive reading is when the speaker is not the source of obligation. The speaker is just describing an obligation. Versus a directive reading, so anyone else can be anyone else in the context, outside of the context, can be the source of obligation in a descriptive reading. In a directive reading, it is the speaker that is the source of obligation. So it all sort of ties in with authority and who's the authority figure, who has the power in a situation, etc. So, so if you guys remember, we said that the gen versus dative, there is a slight preference for the subject with gen to be more amenable to a descriptive reading, where the speaker is not really the authority, speaker is describing, versus the K more saliently gives a directive reading where the speaker is imposing something. Again, contextually, it can vary. Who is talking, who are they talking to, etc. So this subtle difference, I'm trying to find a way to bring out this difference, right? Because Bhadra is predicting these two should be in free variation, meaning they're interchangeable, completely interchangeable. Okay, so one way I see of bringing out this difference is when we embed them under mandative verbs. Okay, so mandative verbs are things like order or instruct. Okay, so so in root clauses, directive modals anchor to the speaker. This is what we learned last time. In embedded clauses, directive modals anchor to the nearest director, that is the matrix subject. So whoever in an embedded clause, the subject is presumably imposing the obligation, and then directive modals will anchor to them. So let's look at these mandative verbs order and instruct. Okay, So suppose you say 16. শিক্ষক ছাত্রকে 3টে বই পড়তে নির্দেশ দিলেন বা শিক্ষক ছাত্রকে 3টে বই পড়তে বললেন. But the meaning is supposed to be the teacher ordered the student to read 3 books. We see, dative case plays on that. So dative mark subject can occur as a subject of the embedded infinitive. If we try to do a genitive, it does not work out. So শিক্ষক ছাত্রর 3টে বই পড়তে নির্দেশ দিলেন বা শিক্ষক ছাত্রর 3টে বই পড়তে বললেন. Where you want to say the same thing. So crucially, what is happening? So we have a directive interpretation, so obligation, that is playing well with the matrix subject. So here, this construction is allowing an interpretation where the direction is coming from the matrix subject, okay, which is the property of a directive model. Whereas with everything else being the same, genitive marking is not working out in these constructions. So the point I'm trying to make here is this goes to show that these two cases are not in free variation when it comes to source of or who is the source of obligation. So the SFO parameter that we looked at. Right. And this is crucially shown by the embedding facts. So clearly, the case difference has some bearing. Okay, it's not just a reflex of movement or whatever it is that you think about it as not being in any way connected to the obligation. It is connected in some way to the obligation. So only data subjects are allowed under such mandative verbs, highlighting their directive use, while genitive subjects are disallowed. So I cannot stand behind this idea that it's a bland reflexive movement. Here is another problem which Bhad himself points out. So he looks at languages like Bangla and he shows that this fact that a possessive construction, a simple possessive like 18, Ram has a book, is a simple possessive, is just genitive, right? Ramer ekta boi ache, it cannot be any other case, has to be genitive. Okay. But as soon as you turn it into the obligational construction, it can allow both either, which is what we were looking at. So, most languages that he's citing in that paper do not have this property. Usually the case is the same across 18 and 19, right? So for example, Hindi, 18 and 19 is the same. Some other languages he cites are the same. Languages like Bangla, at least in his set, are sort of outlier. Why are the cases possibly different? So he says, while I cannot explain why the case marking on the subject of the obligational construction is different from the case marking on the subject of the possessive construction, I will relate this phenomenon to another widely attested phenomenon. So let's look at what his other phenomenon is. So here's examples from Hindi. He's showing in some B possession languages, different kinds of possession get different kinds of cases. So I want all of us to look at, I'm sorry about this numbering, but look at the top A on the right, and then B, C, D. Don't look at the lower A, B yet. So look at, so for example, general possession. Ram mein pratibha hai. So then you have the mein marking on Ram. Then you have, say, something like alienable possession, things that can be taken from you, right? So Ram ke paas ek kitab hai. Don't worry about the quantificational facts right now. But Ram ke paas, so this we have K now. Okay, so this is a alienable possession. Then you have things like what he calls experiencer possession. Ram ko bukhar hai, sir dard hai, cancer hai, some sort of experiencer takes a ko, which morphologically look at these variants, basically is what he's saying. And then you have something like inalienable possession, things that are attached to you in various abstract and physical ways. So Ram ki do betiyan hai. So then now it shows up as ki. then this is inalienable possession. So his point here is, look at these different types of possessions. Morphologically, these differ, okay, in a language like Hindi. Then you look at the obligational construction in the second AB over here on the right. So munde ne jana ai. He says this is Hindi. I had not encountered this before, but maybe you guys know more about this. So his point is, see, look at the ergative marking here. This is an ergative case marking the boy, and he says that the boy has some control over going in this case. Whereas if you have an overt modal, munde nu jana piya hai, then
this is Punjabi.
he calls it Hindi.
अरे अब typo हो गया होगा, but he knows that.
Punjabi, Punjabi.
अच्छा ठीक है, ये पंजाबी है. So then you see with the Punjabi here, when you have an overt modal, then you have a dative marked subject, and he points out that intuitively, apparently, speakers say that in A, the boy has some control over going, whereas in B, the boy really has no control. He has to go because someone else told him to. He has no decision-making power. Speakers of Punjabi can sort of think about that intuition if you agree with that or not. But his idea again here is, look at what he's saying. If you have dative case, then there is no sort of, there is no connection of the agent to the obligation. It's just imposed, and there is like no internal connection. But we are seeing a difference.
Bhatt also gives the examples in her Urdu. So it's and she gives this difference. I mean, I don't have A at all, and
Okay.
B is different. I mean, it's ambiguous for me vis-a-vis the obligation rests with the boy or not. But so standard Hindi speakers on this side of the border are not in Punjab. I don't know about Ojasvi. She might have clear this nay co-distinction, but I don't.
Yeah, my Hindi gets influenced by this Punjabi distinction.
It does.
Yeah.
So it does exist for Hindi speakers. Yeah, please carry on. I just thought.
Yeah. Okay. So crucially, his point is here. Look at these different markings depending on types of possession, right? So remember, he's trying to account for this Bangla facts here, that why are the cases different, right? So it's like, oh, there are many other different types of cases, which is crucial in these languages. You sort of make this distinction. So this is his proposed solution for the Bangla problem. He doesn't go too much into it, and he does not provide Bangla data. He just shows, he just postulates that it's not surprising that the object of the obligational construction will have some other type of case, right? Since all of these types of possession have different cases, then maybe the obligational construction is just another construction with just another type of case. So he says this is not an explanation, but we can reduce the problem to the general facts that different types of possession give you different types of cases. Unfortunately, though, as I said, he does not run through the Bangla facts with this paradigm. And once you do that, you see that it does not play nice with the solution. Right? So in all of these configurations here, Bangla would use air. Okay, apart from these keep these modal ones aside, the second A, B, all of the types of possession, the first A and B, C, D, Bangla would only use the genitive form, air. The same one, I mean. Exact same marking for all of them. Okay, so the language makes no distinction, in case at least, between different kinds of possession. Okay, so it's a mystery then why there is a variation in obligational case. And as I showed you, this is not just about case, right? It is about some other components of obligation like source. And once you embed them under different verbs, it becomes clear. So the important takeaways so far, we have, at least for Bangla, the system we're looking at is the bearer of obligation, speaker of obligation, complement types and case all play some crucial roles. This is between last lecture and this lecture. We have seen across these two lectures. Remember last time we talked about the ought to be versus ought to do readings, and how they show up differently. So none can be ignored or subsumed under another. So a raising analysis does not seem to work across the board for Bangla. So my proposal in the next class would be we need a hybrid approach where we have predicative models with gerund complements will have control structures, and verbal models will have raising structures. And then the challenge becomes, how do all these components come together, right? So control and raising are just parts of the picture. How do all of these other things, which are semantically correlated with the notion of obligation, come together, and also case marking and the type of the complement? Okay. So any questions so far? I think can I go on for 10, 15 minutes more, or should I stop here?
Sorry, please do. I don't think you heard me. Yeah, please do, please do.
Oh, okay. Okay. So we have been talking about infinitives a lot, and we have not yet gotten fully say into a complete analysis of gerunds. But I wanted to start wanted to end today with a beginning of examining gerunds a little bit. So Stowell, 1982, I think this was one of the first distinctions made between gerunds and infinitives. Lots of people have worked on this, especially in the semantic purview of what they encode, what kind of objects these are. But let's look at a couple of crucial points that Stowell makes. So he points out that infinitives and finite clauses have two properties that gerunds lack. Okay, infinitives and finite clauses contain a clause internal composition or projection in which complementizers or WH phrases can appear. We will look at examples in a second. I'm just giving you an overview. Gerunds lack both of these. So gerunds lack a comp projection where complementizers or WH phrases can go. They just lack these constructions altogether. Second property is infinitives and finite clauses contain a tense operator which fixes the understood time frame of the complement clause relative to the tense of the matrix verb. Gerunds do not have any such operators. All right, so let's keep these both in mind, and then let's look at each of them in turn. So, so this part about complementizers, right? So if you notice in English, there are a couple of different, 3, 4 different complementizers, but a crucial property of something like for, the complementizer for, is you can embed an infinitive after for. So it is a complementizer that allows you to embed a non-finite clause. As opposed to, say, a finite clause complementizer like that. So this is a distinction he makes. He says that there is no counterpart of a gerundive complementizer. So there is no complementizer in English that will allow you to embed a gerund after it. And this argument is this evidence is presented to show that it cannot possibly have a comp position. In addition to that, if you don't have, so think about what C does, all that projection of a CP does, it hosts WHs if they move. And you should be able to see evidence of that. So that's the next part that comes. So he shows that WH movement in English, because English overtly shows movement in the syntax, WH movement cannot happen inside gerunds. Okay, and this comes into in a two-pronged way you can think about it. Interrogative predicates, which allow embedding of WH complements plus WH complements, cannot embed gerunds, and prepositions that allow interrogative complements cannot embed gerunds. So let's look at examples of this first. So suppose you have verbs like remember or wonder, which allow interrogative complements. So you can say, I don't remember who we should visit. I wonder where he went. or a preposition like about that allows you to embed a WH question. So we talked about what we ought to do. Okay. So these are all your finite in 20A, B, C. What you have embedded, the WH question has a finite setup, right? So who we should visit, where he went, what he ought to do. In 21, again, we have embedded WH questions, but inside there are infinitive, non-finite versions. So who to visit, where to go, what to do. Again, these are all embeddable under these verbs or this preposition. A gerund counterpart is not able to occur in any of these. Okay, so I don't remember who our visiting or who visiting. I wonder where going, his going. We talked about what doing. All of these are very bad, right? So his point is you cannot, so this point, right? So interrogative predicates or prepositions cannot embed gerunds. Next part showing that this is indeed true is you can see WH movement inside tensed modifiers or infinitival modifiers, but you cannot see it occurring inside gerunds. So what is the internal structure? Can you have WH movement there? Point is, no, you can't. So if you see 23A, the table on which, look at which, it has moved from somewhere, right? So the table on which you should put your code is in the next room. That's your finite setup. The table on which to put your code is in the next room. That's your infinitive. And then the gerund counterpart is just ungrammatical. The table on which putting your code is in the next room. That's not possible. So again, he's using that to show that inside a gerund, you cannot have WH movement, which means there is no place to host movement. So this, the main idea is there is not a position to host a moved WH. Or even trigger WH movement, however you see, what you see C is doing, or the C projection is doing. So that's the first part, which is the comp position evidence that gerunds lack, whereas infinitives and finite clauses have. Then coming to the tense operator part, right? So we might be confused. What does he mean by tense operator? Because infinitives are supposed to not be tensed, right? What does he mean tense operator? So the specific idea he's pursuing is this. It's not talking about, it's talking about a tense interpretation, not so much a T head that is specified for tense features, but a tense interpretation is available. Okay, what is this tense interpretation? So the intuition is that the time frame of an infinitive clause is unrealized with respect to the tense of the matrix. Okay, so he says that when you have a to infinitive in English, it gives you a possible future interpretation. So the idea is, where does this future come from? Why is it not past? Why is it not present? Why is it the future? It's because infinitives inherently have unrealized abstract tense of some sort. So in contrast, he says gerunds, because they do not have any tense operator encoding this kind of thing, it's completely malleable to what the matrix verb is, the tense of the matrix verb. So let's look at some examples. If you have Jenny remembered to bring the wine, this is your infinitive with this pro subject, versus Jenny remembered bringing the wine with the gerund. The interpretation is in A. Jenny remembered to bring the wine. Jenny has not yet brought the wine at the point at which she remembers to do so. So okay. So if this is a little convoluted, think of the time frame of remembering, right? Jenny is remembering something. At the time when she is remembering, she has not yet bought the wine. Or brought the wine. Right. So at the time point where she's remembering to bring the wine, she has not yet brought the wine. Whereas when you say Jenny remembered bringing the wine, at the point of remembering, she has already brought the wine. It's in the past. The bringing the wine part is in the past. People have any questions about this? This is, think of it specifically matrix versus embedded tense. Okay, just in relation to each other. Then say take a predicate like try. So Jim tried to lock the door versus Jim tried locking the door. When you say Jim tried to lock the door, in A, so tried to lock the door, keep that in mind. Jim does not succeed in locking the door when he tries to do so. So when he's trying to lock the door, he's not yet succeeded. Okay. Whereas if you say Jim tried locking the door, this is sort of ambiguous with respect to the tense of the matrix. The tense of the whatever interpretation the gerund is supposed to have is sort of ambiguous. So again, this is going to show that the gerund is more malleable tense-wise, tense interpretation-wise, whereas infinitives are not, and finite clauses are not, obviously, because they're already marked for tense. So, so this is a crucial difference between infinitives and gerunds.
Diti, why is 24B and 25B different? Because what you get in 24B is the backward shifted reading. Mm-hmm. But in 25B, you get this ambiguity. Or are they not distinct?
I think it's to do with the verb try. So try is an implicative verb. So if you follow Landau's classification. So implicative verbs, have this lack of entailment.
Right.
Did it happen or not? So we don't know if it happened or not. So if we don't know if it happened or not, we can't compute it, so that kind of fuzziness.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
So, yeah, so then the moral of the story, comparing all of this, is it is not that he's saying that the gerund may never have an unrealized tense. Remember, unrealized tense is somehow oriented to the future. But what he's saying is a more distinct thing, that it has no internally determined tense. It can have whatever, the understood tense is whatever is determined externally by the verb. So the verbs, the matrix predicates tense is very crucial to the gerund, right? So it takes on that flavor, that tense interpretation. In contrast, infinitival control complements have a uniform internally determined tense, just like finite clauses. So infinitives you can't mold too much. They have this unrealized future interpretation. So remember, I dare not go back all the way to my first few slides, but if you guys remember, I had these bullet points where I was showing that we have these tripartite set of modal complements, right, in the same language, and in many South Asian languages, gerunds, infinitives, and finite clauses. And when we put all this stuff together in the next lecture, we have to remember this contrast, right? Because remember in my bullet points, I was saying gerunds only occur with things that have a specific kind of tense, infinitives, a different kind of tense, etc. So we will put all that stuff together. We have to keep this distinction in mind. Okay, so we have arrived at our task cluster 3 after 1 and 2. So we can do some of these tasks given what we have learned today. So remember in the last class, I asked you to pick out obligation in general in your language with overt modals. Now we're saying, look at the Bhadra type construction, right? Your obligational construction, which is a combination of possession and non-finite, some non-finite units. What does this look like in your language? Okay. Do you see a difference in the case paradigms between obligation and pure possession, like Bangla, or unlike Bangla, like Hindi, where there's not a case difference between obligation and pure possession? And then the question I want to ask is the presence of case tied to the bearer of obligation or source of obligation? So for example, we can ask questions like, does the use of dative on the subject entail that the subject is a bearer of obligation? Okay, that kind of entailment that is divorced in analyses like Bhadra's and others who have raising analysis. So maybe you guys can tell I'm trying to figure out, trying to point us towards a control or a raising or a hybrid direction, right, for these analysis. And then I want all of you to try what I was saying, really brings out the difference, that is embedding under mandative verbs. And you can prove this points that the answers to these by this embedding construction, if you have a difference or not. And then do Stowell's 2 major distinctions between gerunds and infinitives and finite clauses hold up in your language? So these should be simple tests to do. You can just try this data and see if these really distinctions really hold up or not, because that's a major fault line we will have to think about when talking about why these complements allow these different types of, why these models allow these different types of complements and how everything else fits in. Okay, thank you. That's all I have for today.
Diti, I had one observation to make as for the workshop task, which might be relevant because I think people can get just stuck there. So it's been argued that Hindi non-finite clauses and South Asian non-finite clauses, also Bangla, that they don't really have a comp position, because you can, there is no narrow scope WH question that you can possibly make. So तुम्हें किससे मिलना है only has wide scope. And one of the arguments that people have made for the infinitiver is that well, it's a nominal category and there is no CP. So that should fact. I mean, that's an hypothesis that you could also explore. That can you get? I mean, and is the gerund any different then for the languages that have the gerund? Just to flag this.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. So, so when you are
check whether
talking
the
about
comp don't only check for wide scope, check for narrow scope as well.
Yeah. So any possible interpretation that is felicitous with the WH complement. Any other questions?
Any observations, anything? So could we take a class of verbs, just one thing, for the workshop so that everybody has the same class? So should we do remember, try, you know?
Oh, you're talking about in the end, the stowel facts?
Yeah,
or?
the stowel facts. So that everybody looks at the same kind of verbs.
Yeah, even if you do, for the interrogative complements, you can do these ones that he has here.
Yeah.
About does not, so I have tried to do this about test in Bangla. It's kind of iffy for me, but people can try that if it is. What is the infinitive in Hindi? Actually, infinitive and gerund is the same marking, right? So na. So we say, I want to eat. Yeah. So there's a syncretism there. So if you look at the last lecture handouts, Bhat, Miriam, so Rajesh, Miriam, etc. have this study on Hindi modals, where they have these constructions like Yasin ko ye karna hai, or Yasin ko ye karna chahiye. And all of these, so whether or not you do the possession like hai or actual overt modals like chahiye, hoga, padega, in Hindi, they always show up with the na form. So ye karna or jana, whatever. So, and they say that Hindi always takes an infinitive complement. So in my last handout, I had Masikas. We talked a lot about Masikas, analysis of South Asia, modals, complements, and Hindi is one of them that he, I think, gets right. If Rajesh and Miriam are also right, that it's always infinitive and never gerund. So distinguishing the two senses somehow, like even when you have gerund subjects, right? Like killing animals is not good. Even in those cases, Hindi has na, right? So killing people is not good. So insan marna achhi baat nahi hai. So marna, again, there is no construction where it shows up as anything else. It's always na. So that claim, Rajesh Miriam's claim that it's always an infinitive complement that modals have, all modals in Hindi have infinitive complements as their claim.
Yeah, so when
So one
Utpal is
has-
asking, can we distinguish the two senses somehow?
Uh-huh.
So would there be a test that would only go, which would be okay only with gerunds, and that would tell you that if it's that there is ambiguity? It's, I mean, besides these tests.
So usually the English test people give is these arbitrary pro constructions. So walking in the morning is good, where you use a gerund instead of a. So to walk in the morning is good, is slightly degraded than walking in the morning. So the idea is in these pro-arb situations, gerunds are more preferred in arbitrary pro.
What about
than infinitives.
while reading or something?
While walking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, so I'm
so
saying,
I saw-
does that mark out a gerundive reading?
It should. What is
Yeah.
while in Hindi? Why it's a reduplicated structure, right?
Yeah.
Right. So chalte chalte मैंने देखा.
मेरे गीत
Which
ये
is
गीत
not-
याद रखना. So that would be one.
So what did you say is a distinction?
No, so I guess that if you get a simultaneity reading, then you may have the gerund.
How? So what's your sentence again, Aisha?
मैं चलते चलते गाना गा रहा था. That could be but that's no longer the infinitival form, and I'm not sure that it is the gerund at all. It might be just a participle. And it's reduplicated. So I don't know how to distinguish the two. So, but I guess for languages that have this, and they have three different forms, and it's different.
Three different forms, and at least Hindi should also have the finite forms with some models. So if we look, if we try, so in the last task clusters, we were positing we could do some of these. Look at this table. So based on syntactic category having different complements, or at least some, so one has to do a survey of all of the deontic necessity cases. But maybe there are lexical items that do allow finite clauses. So then Hindi would have two. I'm not convinced that Hindi only takes infinitive clauses, small complements. Unless I see a table with all of the possible forms and showing that. Yeah, indeed. And as I said, Masika only looked at want, so that's not. That's okay. Any other comments, questions?
Hello, Diti.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do this Stavel's diagnostic tests, and so this, I don't remember who I was visiting. That's for the interrogative predicates of prepositions cannot embed gerunds. That one, right? Right. So in Bangla we can have something like আমার মনে নেই কার আসার কথা, or তুমি কি করার কথা ভাবছো. So is this causing any problem for this diagnostic test?
As you can see, I have not included Bangla facts in this diagnostics. I just wanted to post the diagnostics. Yes, we can do something like that. So if you remember Kotha, for people who don't speak Bengali, I think the sentence was, Kotha is this model over here. It's a type of, like a supposed to, or the type of deontic necessity model. Okay, and it takes a gerund. And this can occur as a complement. So the kotha and its gerund complement together can appear as the complement of a verb like remember. I think Orko's dissertation might have some stuff about gerunds and different verbs embedding, right, Orko?
Yeah, gerunds and attitude verbs, reacting with different kinds of attitude verbs. Some verbs do not take gerunds at all, like mone hawa, it cannot embed any kind of gerund. Because I proposed in my thesis that maybe it is due to the fact that the internal argument of mone hawa is always propositional. Okay, so it is always contentful, to be precise. So that is the reason it cannot embed gerunds, which are basically the properties of eventualities. So that's the reason. But some verbs do, right? Like mone pora in Bangla, jana in Bangla in certain cases, dekha, boja, bhule jawa. It's the they do.
So think, forget, understand.
Think do not, but there is a interesting distinction with the types of complements and the verb bhava. Okay, when bhava takes a gerund, it is a recall or remember sense.
Yeah.
Okay. But when it takes a bole clause, this is something like think. Okay, and with a j clause, it can have both. It can be a think interpretation, it can be a remember or recall interpretation, depending on the context. Like আমি অস্ট্রেলিয়ার ম্যাচ জেতাগুলো ভাবছিলাম. Okay, that is a pure recall sense.
Can you translate, Orko?
Yeah, that is I was thinking of the events of Australia winning those matches. So when I am using bhava to embed a gerund, so obligatorily we are having the recall sense or remember sense. But if I say আমরা অস্ট্রেলিয়া জিতেছে বলে ভেবেছি, so we thought that Australia won the match, but it might turn out to be false in our actual world. So when the complement is a bole clause, this is a pure think reading or a pure think reading, and with the j clause it is basically ambiguous depending on the context. So we can say that আমরা ভাবছিলাম যে আমরা ছোটবেলায় খুব মজা করতাম. That's like we were thinking or recalling that we used to have a lot of fun in our childhood. So and we can say like আমরা ভাবছি যে আমরা খুব মজা করব. That is a pure think reading. The embedded tense is indicating to the fact that this is not a remember or recall context.
So in short, there are interactions between verbs and whether they can embed gerunds.
Yeah. Bishwash kora cannot embed. Yeah, bishwash kora, dabi kora. They bishwash kora means believe, dabi kora means claim. They cannot embed gerunds. Mone hawa, think, they cannot embed gerunds. আমি ওর যাওয়াটা বিশ্বাস করছি. This is bad. This is not good.
So in short, read Orko's thesis about this topic. Oh, okay. Any others? I know it's getting late for people, so.
Just a counterpoint, and please help Orko, that we can say something like আমি ওর যাওয়াটা মেনে নিতে পারছি না বা মানতে পারছি না, right?
Yeah, that is মেনে নিতে পারছে না, but I was focusing on মনে হওয়া. Okay, that is thing. Okay, so
yeah, I'm just wondering if mante's manuing is also believed to believe or to accept, right?
Accept, I will bet,
Yeah.
or rather say, it is kind of accept. Like, and mere now and para, so interaction with that ability model. So it is giving rise to the reading such as accept or something like that.
Yeah.
And there are other non-factives too that can embed gerunds, like asha kora.
Yeah.
আমরা ওর জেতাটা আশা করেছিলাম, but
Yeah.
basically we expected him to win the match, okay, but he failed.
Yeah.
So this is the thing.
So when you guys do these tests, you might run into some of these issues because because South Asian languages have a lot of verbs with the do added that changes the meaning. So a nominal form, like, so say Bangla claim is actually a two-part unit with claim and then do. And then once you have a verbal projection like that, it may or may not allow gerund embedding versus infinitive embedding versus finite. So some of these things are not so straightforward when we look at our languages. So I think, as Aisha suggested, maybe having a set bunch of verbs, maybe just these two even, remember and wonder for everybody. I mean, wonder is also tricky, right? Wonder is want to know, right? Like,
and remember is two-part in Hindi.
Two-part in Hindi.
Even mone kora, if that's what we would use, that's two-part in Bangla too, no?
Yeah. A lot of these verbs are two-part.
Yeah, mone kora has also a think, avatar, and then recall.
Yeah.
Feel and
So-
to remember.
Yeah, think and remember.
I think Vinita and others have used want to know. So wonder doesn't exist in some of these languages, right? So it's want to know, janna chaha. So Vinita, etc. I remember talking about this with her. Use want to know as one unit. That is a rogative predicate that allows an interrogative complement. In lieu of wonder.
In Bangla, bhava can also refer to that sense of wondering. Ami bhabchi kal ki hobe. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering what will happen tomorrow. So bhava is basically
Response. So bhava is a responsive predicate in Bangla.
Then it is
Allows
Then it is
Yeah.
acting as a responsive predicate, but not like no and something like that. Because this is
So
the one.
right. So if you want so Saul doesn't make these things came much later, responsive, interrogative, etc. Utpal is here, so he can tell us. But so if you just want, we can all use just want to know, if that works. And then I don't think there is a language which does remember with one unit. If you see a language where remember is just one unit, and even if it's 2 units, if we are doing wonder with want to know, we can also do remember. I mean, maybe it's a feature, not a bug, right? So the point is that these are predicates in our languages that are built this way, and they very well interact with the type of complements they're taking because they're built this way. Right, I can't. Yeah, so because we have so much kora that do support the do parts for many of these. So for example, the Bangla verbs, the verbal models we looked at do not allow gerunds, right? At least in the dialect we're talking about. So those are kind of related to the kora things that Orko was saying. Kora is also to do. Whenever you have this do projection, you somehow block the gerunds.
Yeah.
You only allow infinitives. Right? Okay. But yeah, anyway, so So yeah, when looking at this task, the last one, I guess just keep in mind, be very aware of what predicates you're using and what alternatives you could use. Because even for try, it's a two-part thing, right? Koshish kiya. Okay, should we call it a day?
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Everybody
Okay.
stand into
Thank you,
silence.
Diti.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you guys on the 9th, I think.
Yeah.